Hello and welcome to the Kim Iverson Show. Thank you guys so much for being here. Some of the, debunking some of the IDF lies. They've got some more lies going on when it comes to the flower massacre that happened last week where over 100 people were killed just trying to get food, the starving Gazans. We're going to be talking about that today. Let's move on to the peace talks, the negotiation. There's a negotiation here happening with Hamas. They're trying to do truce talks, but Israel isn't showing up to those. Israel had a deal that they put forward on the table 6 weeks in exchange for all of the hostages. The problem with Israel, like I mentioned, is they're saying that it doesn't matter if they get all their hostages back. They're going to continue to go forward with the war until Hamas is eradicated. They keep saying this over and over again, but Hamas is an ideology. It's a political party. It's like saying we're not stopping until every Trump supporter, until we eradicate Trump support for Trump, until we eradicate MAGA. We're not going to stop fighting until we eradicate MAGA. You're not going to be able to do that. And not only that, but if you do, who rises up? Who rises up once Hamas is gone? You're going to end up with another radical organization, and that's what Israel banks on. That's what's been going on over and over the last, for 75 years, is that they would look at the current Palestinian, like the current Palestinian Authority, for example, and they say, oh, they're terrorists. We can't work with them. And then what rises up? Hamas, a more extreme organization, rises up. But here's the article from Al Jazeera. Hamas officials arrive in Cairo for Gaza truce talks, but no sign of Israel. Hamas officials have arrived in Cairo, Egypt, for talks on securing a truce in the Gaza war after a U.S. official indicated that Israel had endorsed a framework for a temporary ceasefire and exchange of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners. So the framework has been 1 day for every one hostage. That is what Israel wants. So you give a hostage, we'll give you 1 day. That buys them 6 weeks. But the problem is that Israel said to Hamas, we now want a list of all of the hostages who are alive, and Hamas refused to give them that list. Now, why would Hamas refuse to give them that list? Because, one would deduce that maybe maybe there just aren't that many alive anymore. Maybe there's quite a few who have died in one way or another, or they're lost. Remember, these hostages had been kind of, from what we understood, the hostages have been spread out all around the entirety of Gaza, and various different organizations had, like the PLJ and Hamas had some, and there were some, other groups that had been taking in hostages. And so they were housing them all around. Well, when the entire area is being bombed, I would imagine it's difficult to keep track of them. I would imagine they get lost. I would imagine that some of them are under the rubble. I would imagine that Hamas has not been able to keep track of these, hostages, and that's why they're not willing to give the list. I don't think they're not giving them the list for any other reason other than they just don't know. There's no reason for them not to give the list. They've been giving the list. They've been saying who they have in their custody this entire time. So the fact that they won't give them the list now, the list could be a lot smaller. The living hostages list could be a lot smaller than what Israel wants, what even Hamas wishes. And that buys the Palestinians in Gaza less time. If the trade is 1 for 1, 1 day for one hostage, and you have half of the hostages you once had, you're going to end up with fewer days. And so maybe that's why they don't want to release the list. It's unclear. I mean, we could just speculate. I can't imagine what other reason they wouldn't release that list other than they just don't know, or the people are dead. Goes on to say that Hamas representatives arrived in Cairo on Sunday, but early evening there was no delegation from Israel for the talks mediated by envoys from Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, with Israeli media reporting that Israel had not sent a team after the Palestinian group declined to share a list of captives who were still alive in the besieged territory. Quote, there's no Israeli delegation in Cairo. Israeli outlet Ynet quoted unidentified Israeli officials as saying, quote, Hamas refuses to provide clear answers, and therefore there's no reason to dispatch the Israeli delegation. Well, sure there is. Look, if they don't know who's alive anymore because they're potentially buried, they've been lost in the scattering of all the people throughout Gaza, you'd want a ceasefire in order to at least count your hostages. I mean, that would be one reason to do it, to demand, look, we'll stop firing on you, we'll stop bombing you, we'll start sending in aid, but we demand a head count. We demand proof of life. I mean, that would be the first step, I would imagine. Allow them the time in some, without chaos, to count who they have. The other reason why you'd want to stop and you'd want to have a ceasefire is because you just don't want to continue to be homicidal maniacs, right? Or genocidal maniacs. You'd want to stop and realize that the world is against you. You've done a lot of damage. You say you're going to try to eradicate Hamas, yet you allow the Hamas leaders to continue hiding out wherever it is they're hiding out. They're not in Gaza. You've got one guy in Gaza who they say they've lost contact with. They're not sure where he is. So they've said that there's going to be some difficulty having negotiations when the one Hamas leader hasn't been heard from in a week. Maybe he's dead. Who knows? Or maybe he's just, again, the place is destroyed. So it'd be difficult to get a hold of him, difficult to contact people, difficult to figure out where people are. But they continue to bombard. They continue to make it very difficult for the Palestinian civilians to survive. They think that, and that's clearly not a strategy that's working. So if their strategy is just make life in Palestine and Gaza so unbearable that Hamas gives up, well, they've done that and it's not working. And they've also said to Hamas, look, you give us all of our hostages, we'll give you 1 day for every hostage, but then after that, we're still coming after you. That doesn't seem like a very good deal for the Palestinian people. Like, oh, you're going to give us 6 weeks or you're going to give us 4 weeks of time to do what? So the other thing Hamas wants in this negotiation, I think it's a smart thing for them to be asking for, is they're asking for a return for the Palestinians up to the north. They want to ensure that the Palestinian people are not being ethnically cleansed from the land. They want to ensure that Israel isn't going to take over the land and start building settlements. So part of these negotiations, they're not willing to accept anything other than what needs to be part of the negotiation is they want the hostages to be able to return to the north. Now, Israel has come back and said, well, why? It's destroyed. I can't imagine why you'd want to do that, right? Which was the exact reason why they destroyed it. I mean, the fact that the leaders are now saying, why would you want to do that? It's, there's no hospitals, there's no schools, there's nothing up there. I mean, geez, that just goes to show what their plan was to begin with. The reason why they wiped everything off the map up in the north was because they didn't want people to want to return. And they're shocked that people want to return, that the Hamas wants to negotiate for a return of the people. Gaza was already a highly populated, densely populated area. And then they condensed everybody into an even smaller area. Now the Palestinians want to return home. They're going to have to rebuild. It's going to be terrible. They're going to be living amongst rubble in the north. But to Palestinians, resistance is existence. Being on the land, not being displaced, not being shoved into Egypt, not being carted off on boats to Lebanon or wherever else the Israelis want to take them as their grand master plan to ethnically cleanse the land and to take it over for themselves. The Palestinians just think being there is the resistance. So they want to return, and that's part of the negotiations. And I do think that that is a smart angle for the negotiation. It would ensure, for a period of time. I mean, I would still imagine that Israel would allow the people to go up to the north, and then they'd say, but look, they can't stay. There's no services. There's no hospitals. There's no schools. There's no roads. There's nothing. There's nowhere for them to live. Nothing's habitable. So they can't really stay. I mean, we'll let them go up there and we'll let them sit for a couple of months. But then after that, there needs to be a long-term solution, which includes removing the Palestinian people out of Gaza so that Israel can go in and rebuild as Israel, rebuild the land as Israel. So we'll keep an eye on these negotiations. But Israel's offering a bum deal. Their whole thing is we're not going to stop under any circumstance. That is the problem with Netanyahu. That is why the U.S. government is now meeting with Benny Gantz. That's probably why they're trying to find some other ally in the Israeli government, because Netanyahu's made it clear nothing stops this war. Nothing stops this war until they defeat Hamas, which is an ideology. And once they defeat Hamas, then they're going to turn around and say, oh, but the PLJ is here. Oh, but there's this other organization and they're terrorists and we can't allow them. It's just going to be a never-ending shifting of the narrative and moving the goalposts, and that's what we've seen. We've seen that for 75 years. We're seeing that now. The whole goal, we know the goal, it is to ethnically cleanse all of the Palestinians off of the land. And they're unfortunately doing a very good job of that. But hopefully Netanyahu is on his way out. Hopefully somebody else is on their way in. And hopefully there can be some sort of diplomatic solution to this. It's kind of, it feels like a real lost cause. So there's been some dispute about the flour massacre, whether or not Palestinians were shot while trying to get some food, some bags of flour from the IDF when they came in with the aid trucks. The IDF claims that people were run over, that it was a stampede, and that people were suffocating to death, that they weren't shot. Doctors have instead said no. In fact, 80% of the here's one, the 80% of the wounds from the hospital were actually from gunshot wounds, and that only about 20% of what they were treating was from stampede-like symptoms. There was a recent, let me just show you this. There was a recent press conference, and this is what was asked. This is what the United States has to say about the flour massacre, about the information we now have about it. So this is kind of an update. Here's the questioning. Watch this.
On what happened last Thursday, you're saying that we've seen what desperate people needing food and so on. What could are you saying that the tragedy was the result of the stampede of people?
There's an investigation ongoing by the government of Israel. I know they've released a preliminary assessment, but there's a further investigation going on. But clearly, the reason all those people were out there in the first place at 4:30 in the morning, I think it's easy to lose sight of that. This is not in the middle of the day, it's 4:30 in the morning. Right. And the reason that many people were out there was because they're so desperate for food and assistance. When aid trucks roll in, especially in the middle of the night, you shouldn't have to see people swarming them for aid. They should have confidence that aid will be distributed. But they don't right now, and for good reason, because aid hasn't been getting there and they're desperate to feed their families.
Okay, but you don't doubt that the Israeli military fired on those people? That there were gunshots?
They have offered a public assessment of what's happened, and they said that they did fire in one context. We do not have any independent confirmation of how the actual events rolled out. I know that there are differing assessments and conflicting evidence about what happened, which is why we're going to wait the outcome of the investigation.
Yeah, but I mean, as wonderful as it is to send in aid by airplanes, I mean, 38,000 meals, that's like 0.0717 to each one person. I mean, that's a very small amount. The best way, obviously, is via ground. And the U.S. can't send in trucks. I don't think that the Israelis would shoot or would fire on, American-controlled trailer trucks and so on.
So I think you number one are missing everything I just said, both in my opening comments please don't interrupt, because I didn't interrupt you, about the fact that these airdrops are intended to supplement, not replace. And while they are insufficient by themselves, they are still important and will provide meals to people who otherwise did not have them. So we do feel they meet a critical need, and we will continue them. But that does not change the fundamental underlying issue, which is we do need to get more aid in through land delivery and potentially through sea delivery, and that's what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. First of all, I'm not dismissing the value of that. In fact, I asked that question last week if the U.S. would do something like this. Nor was I interrupting you. I'm just saying I realize that it's an effort, but it's a very small effort. There are other ways, and even by sea. I mean, I understand the U.S. military has these wonderful causeways. They can roll things in. You don't have to have a harbor and so on. But that is still inefficient. I mean, it's the United States and Egypt and so on. If there is a political decision, to ensure, to basically force Israel to allow trucks in, I believe that they will prevail. You don't think that the U.S. can prevail if it pressures Israel to allow these trucks in?
We are making clear that more trucks need to come in from the senior-most levels of this government.
Okay, a couple more questions. Of course, I think it was raised that there's something like 15 children that have already died of starvation in Gaza, and there seems to be maybe hundreds more in the coming days and so on. So the situation is very, very desperate. Let me ask you about UNRWA. Have you arrived at a decision on continuing aid or resuming aid to UNRWA?
We have made clear that we are going to make that determination at the conclusion of the 2 investigations the UN is conducting with respect to UNRWA. Neither of those investigations has concluded at this
Do
point.
you have any calendar or timetable on this camp? Because the people in UNRWA are saying that the situation is horrible.
It's a question you should direct to the UN about how long those 2 investigations will take.
But you are not demanding that the UN, sort of speed up the process.
I think it's in the UN's interest that the investigations be completed as soon as possible. I'm sure that they're well aware of that.
And finally, I have one. Can you share with us any update on the talks?
On the hostage talks?
Right.
No, I'm not going to read those out in detail, other than to say, as I said in my opening comments, that there is a deal on the table, and that deal would get hostages out. It would deliver a temporary ceasefire of 6 weeks, and it would allow more aid to come in. So we hope Hamas will accept the deal.
Well, it's also actually Israel that is not wanting to accept that deal because they don't want, they're demanding a list, which I think might also just be a ploy to wait, to stall, because they want to continue the bombing. They want to continue making life as miserable as possible for the Palestinians, so that the world says, oh, well, they can't stay. They have to go. Go ahead and take the land. Go ahead and settle it for yourselves. The good thing about Matt Miller in his conversation here and in this questioning, in this press conference, is he does acknowledge the fact that the Palestinian people are starving and they're desperate. And you look, when people are desperate and they're starving, shit happens. Many people own guns, not because they're afraid of the government and some sort of uprising or a civil war, or not because they're afraid. Many people own guns because they're afraid of natural disasters just hitting their town, and there being desperation for resources. And in those moments, people who are otherwise good, law-abiding citizens start to become criminals. They're going to steal, they're going to break in, they're going to do what they can in order to feed their families. When their families are on the line, it's people go into survival instinct. So you've got the Palestinians in this situation right now where they are starving. You've got 15 children who have already starved to death. More people are starving. They're worried about, they've got all these problems. And so, of course, when these aid trucks roll in, the reason why these people are going and clamoring and there's chaos that breaks out is because they don't believe they're going to be, they think that's their one chance to eat. That's their one chance to feed their families. And so, of course, it's going to get hostile. Of course, it's going to become chaotic. Of course, there's going to be looting and there's going to be treachery that happens when people are starving and they're just trying to get those resources. That should have been something that the IDF took into consideration before they rolled in those aid trucks. They should recognize that there's going to be chaos. And the last thing they should be doing is firing into the crowd in order to create more chaos. And that is what the IDF said. We weren't trying to shoot the people. We just, we were shooting because it was becoming chaotic. Who thinks it's a good idea to shoot in the middle of chaos? Do you think that's going to calm people down, that they're going to hear gunshots and stop? Or do you think people who've been traumatized, who are being bombarded, shot, maimed, buried under rubble, do you think those people are going to think that, oh, the gunshots mean stay still, calm down? Or do you think they think gunshots mean become more frantic, your life is on the line, when they've seen everybody around them get shot and killed and bombed to death? Of course, shooting into the crowd, but this is what the IDF has to say. Let me just play this one for you. This is their excuse about the Flower Massacre. Over 100 people were killed in this Flower Massacre. The doctors are saying that it was gunshot wounds. They're saying 80% were gunshot wounds. There is one report with one eyewitness saying that the majority of the injuries was from a stampede. So one news outlet with one eyewitness that stated that. Every other eyewitness, all the doctors, the UN on the ground, they've all said, no, these were from gunshot wounds. The IDF fired into a crowd of people starving to death, trying to get themselves flour. That's what the IDF did. And not only that, but CNN is now even telling a different story than the typical pro-Israel story. And they said, well, actually, this is a pattern, a fairly common pattern of Israel firing into crowds when people are trying to get aid. I mean, this is something that they've been doing. This is a pattern of behavior of the IDF. This isn't just a one-time thing of, oh no, these people stampeded. Here is what the IDF had to say for themselves about the Flower Massacre.
On
Sorry, not that one. This one.
In the
Here we
early
go.
hours of Thursday morning, the Israel Defense Forces facilitated a humanitarian operation to help bring aid to civilians in northern Gaza. This was the fourth night in a row that we facilitated such an operation because we want humanitarian aid to reach Gazan civilians in need. You see, our war is not against the people of Gaza. Our war is against Hamas. It is Hamas who started this war on October 7th. It is Hamas that had caused immense suffering to civilians on both sides of the border. The IDF has concluded an initial review of the unfortunate incident where Gazan civilians were trampled to death and injured as they charged to the aid convoy. Our initial review has confirmed that no strike was carried out by the IDF towards the aid convoy. The majority of Palestinians were killed or injured as a result of the stampede. From the information we gathered from the commanders and forces on the ground, our initial review has indicated that following the warning shots fired to disperse the stampede and after our forces had started retreating, several looters approached our forces and posed an immediate threat to them. According to the initial review, the soldiers responded towards several individuals. As a professional military committed to international law, we are committed to examining our operations thoroughly. We have opened an inquiry to examine the incident further, which will help us reduce the risk of such a tragic incident from occurring again during one of our humanitarian operations. The incident will be examined in the fact-finding and assessment mechanism, an independent, professional, and expert body. For the sake of transparency, we will share updates as our examination develops, hopefully in the coming days. I want to make something clear. Our war is against Hamas, not against the people of Gaza. This is why we are facilitating aid, creating humanitarian corridors, establishing unilateral humanitarian pauses, and exercising caution in our use of force. Israel and the international community are working together to enable the entry and distribution of humanitarian aid to the residents of Gaza. We coordinated an airdrop of humanitarian aid into Gaza, conducted by the United States Central Command and the Royal Jordanian Air Force. This is an important effort. We encourage all efforts, all of them, to help alleviate the suffering of civilians in Gaza. We have coordinated a total of 21 airdrops in northern Gaza in collaboration with France, the UAE, Jordan, Egypt, and the United States. We will continue expanding our humanitarian efforts to the civilians' population in Gaza while we fulfill our goals of freeing our hostages from Hamas and freeing Gaza from Hamas.
Okay, so listen, he's saying no, it wasn't. We didn't really do it. It's not us. It's not us. And some people are comparing this to the hospital, the big hospital story where we all believed that Israel had struck a hospital, and it turned out that nobody really knew exactly. I mean, there was several investigations that were done with regarding that hospital and whether or not. Well, first of all, we know that the hospital was not leveled; it was struck, but it was the parking lot where there were several hundreds of people gathered, maybe even thousands of people in the parking lot seeking shelter. Then there was investigations, right? Israel said, no, it wasn't us. It was Hamas. They did it. And then they said, no, it was okay. It was the IPJ. Then there was a lot of investigation on, well, no, it might have actually been a failed rocket or a failed Iron Dome rocket. There was all of these different stories. But Israel basically said, we don't target hospitals. And this is what this spokesperson is saying now, Daniel Hagari. He is saying, we didn't do this. We don't do that. We believe in humanitarian aid. But then, if you remember after the hospital incident, when they claimed over and over, you guys are a bunch of liars, you believe Hamas, you shouldn't be believing Hamas, you should believe us. Then after that, they went and targeted hospital after hospital after hospital after hospital. And now there is only one functioning hospital in all of Gaza. So when they said, we don't target hospitals, we're not that type of military, and now there's only one functioning hospital in Gaza, what does that tell you? So this spokesperson is again saying the same story of, we don't target humanitarian aid convoys, we wouldn't do that. But meanwhile, other people are saying, well, actually, you do. Here's CNN. This is an old article. This is not from the Flower Massacre. This is from a few weeks back, saying Israeli forces fired on food convoy in Gaza, UN documents and satellite analysis revealed. And this is just one of many incidences. There are numerous incidences where we have found Israel has fired upon humanitarian aid. This story here, Israeli forces fired on United Nations convoy carrying vital food supplies in central Gaza on February 5th. So this is not the Flower Massacre, before ultimately blocking the trucks from progressing to the northern part of the territory where Palestinians are on the verge of famine, according to documents shared exclusively by the UN and CNN's own analysis. So this is not coming from Hamas. This is coming from the UN and CNN doing their own analysis. And they're saying, yeah, Israeli military fired on this food convoy. And this is a pattern of behavior. They're saying that this is just happening often, that this is not just a one-time thing. So when the Israelis say, we don't do that, well, okay, this one made news. This one made big news because so many people were killed. But what about these other stories where you did do that? And what about the future stories where I'm sure you will do that again, just like you said, well, we don't target hospitals, and now there are no hospitals in Gaza except for one. So how do you explain that if you don't target hospitals? How do you explain you don't target food convoys when food convoys continue to say that they're being targeted by the IDF? Now, some people say, well, no, but Hamas, there's looting, there's other issues. The Palestinians are also causing problems with the food convoys. Well, of course, because they're starving. They're starving and they're desperate. So of course there's going to be chaos. It is up to those delivering the aid. It's up to those that are causing this massive level of desperation, the IDF, to ensure that these people can somehow get this aid without it being disastrous. Why is it turning into chaos? Because these people do not believe that there will be a sufficient amount of aid to care for them. They do not believe they're going to have enough. They're not getting enough. And so they're scrambling. They're desperate. Here's from the Guardian. And this article was also a few weeks ago. Let's see if I can get a date on this. February 21st. Gaza aid deliveries paused amid incredible level of desperation. The World Food Program says that the territory is hanging by a thread as food supplies run out and efforts to deliver aid are derailed. New fighting and a deepening breakdown in public order in northern Gaza have derailed a humanitarian effort to avert a famine in parts of the battered territory, with senior aid officials describing an incredible level of desperation as food supplies run out. A UN attempt to deliver 10 convoys of food aid to northern Gaza over 7 days was suspended earlier this week. Now, remember, this was mid-February. After trucks were looted by crowds, a driver was beaten and gunfire reported amid chaotic scenes. Reports of fresh clashes between Israeli troops and Hamas militants in northern Gaza have reinforced fears that fighting may continue across the territory for many months if there's no ceasefire, further complicating relief efforts. The looting incidents were the latest in a series of such attacks, which began around a month ago. Some have involved organized and armed gangs, but most appear spontaneous. So you've got spontaneous starving people, and those spontaneous starving people are clamoring for the food. It's, of course, going to be chaotic because they're not getting enough and they're starving. And so that should be taken into consideration when you're delivering aid. And instead, the Israelis fire into the crowds. They fire at the convoys. They see the chaos and they think, it's Hamas. All of this is Hamas. It's not just starving civilians. So, again, this is just another one of those. There's several narratives. The Israelis say, we didn't fire at the crowds. This was a stampede. Then you've got CNN, the UN, you've got doctors at the hospital saying, well, a bunch of these people are shot and you guys have done this before. So who are you going to believe? Same thing with the hospital. I mean, look, like maybe there's when it comes to the hospital bombing, the hospital strike, there's conflicting reports. There's even satellite imagery, various, to kind of to pick and choose who you want to believe when it comes to where they think the rocket came from. It looked like it was an accident, no matter what, whether it was from the Palestinian side or whether it was from the Israeli side. It looked like it was an accident. But of course, Israel got the blame. Israel says, well, how dare you blame us? Well, of course, we're going to blame you when you continue to target hospitals. The same thing here with the food convoys. Of course, we're going to blame you when you block aid from being delivered into Gaza, when you fire at aid convoys, when you then fire at people when they're trying to clamor for bags of flour. Of course, we're going to blame you because you're the most likely culprit because you've done it before. So that's where we're at with that.